important for like the Black Duck folks. But hey, I'll wait to get him on there anyway. Okay, now we're on the internet. Fantastic. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome folks that are online. A couple announcements before we jump into things. Today is lesson 6, just to give you a preview of where we're looking for the next few weeks. Next week, there is no confirmation, no worship, no nothing, because it's Thanksgiving week. And so that Wednesday, there's nothing going on here. Have a great Thanksgiving. And then when we come back 2 weeks from tonight, November 30th, last Wednesday in November, we're having our first service night. And I'm putting together a bunch of different opportunities for all the small groups. I will let you guys know by email what your group is going to be doing on that evening. And we've got a whole bunch of different options for that. Basically, there's 2 main focuses. One is going to be inside the church, where we're going to do things like making some new instruments for worship, or writing cards for kids that are sick and in the hospital, things like that. And then there's a number of, and then also making dog toys for Great River Rescue. That's also going to be here. But then there's also some opportunities for stuff outside the church, things like ringing bells with the Salvation Army, working at Churches United, possibly Boys and Girls Club. We don't know yet? Okay, we don't know yet. So that information will be coming out to you by email. And generally speaking, for those of you who are going to be here for service night, you can come and go to worship, and then afterwards we have that hour of time, 7:15 to 8:15, to do the service projects that we're doing. For those of you who are going to be out and about in the community, generally speaking, it's going to be something that you're going to go to before worship would be over. So you wouldn't come to church on that night. When you know where you're going to be, I'll be in touch with the small group leaders and all of you individually with your parents to know maybe you're going to meet at Lucan South to do bell ringing starting at 6:30. Maybe you're going to be at Churches United in the back room there, and you can get dropped off, picked up there. I will let you know. But generally speaking, the out of church events are slightly longer, and so you wouldn't be coming to church during that time. Okay? But watch your emails for more information about that. Again, that's 2 weeks from tonight, November 30th. Okay, those are my major announcements. Let's jump into what we're talking about tonight. So, who can remind me what we were talking about last week? Well, actually, let's back up even more. We're still in the first book of the Bible, right? Yes. What's the first book of the Bible called? Genesis. Which means? Beginning, absolutely. Except tonight, we're not going to be in the entirety of the first book. We're going to jump into the second book. But for now, we're in the first book. So, what did we talk about last week? Who did we talk about last week? Anybody remember? Back here. What was that? Esau and Jacob. Yes, 2 brothers, 2 twins. Esau and Jacob. Now, what was their deal? Did they get along together? Not so much. Chesney? No, they did not. That's right. What were they fighting about? Yes. It was a vocab word, birthright? Oh, yeah. Yes, birthright. Yeah, so who was supposed to get the birthright? Do you guys remember? Was it Jacob or Esau? Esau. And Esau was the one who was technically older, even though they were twins. He came out and Jacob was holding on to his heel. Remember that whole thing? And Esau was the hairy guy who liked to hunt, right? Whereas Jacob, not so much. He was more the inside kind of guy who was a little bit sneaky. And so Esau, because he was technically the firstborn, somebody's losing their drink there. Because Esau was technically the firstborn, he would have gotten the birthright. But Jacob wanted that. So what did he do? Who remembers? What did Jacob do? Yeah, Bree. He pretended to be Esau so that he could get his father's blessing. Now, that doesn't seem like it would work, right? I mean, most parents can tell their kids apart, even if they're twins, and these twins weren't particularly identical. So why did he think that was going to work? You guys remember what was up with Isaac, their dad? Yeah, Jake. He was blind. Yeah, he was very old, and he wasn't really able to see very well, and so he probably wasn't going to be able to tell by sight which of his sons was there. Now, was that enough, do you think, to fool Isaac? No. In fact, Isaac's wife, the twins' mother, had some ideas about this too, didn't she? And she kind of encouraged Jacob to do some stuff to trick his dad. What was it that he did? Besides the fact that Isaac was blind, what did they do to trick him? Yeah. They put stuff on his arms. Who remembers what kind of stuff? Trinity? Wool, yeah, lambskin, sheepskin type stuff so that his arms would feel rough, right? And what else did they do to make him seem like his brother? He wore some of his brother's stinky clothes, right? Because Esau, as the Bible says, had a particular odor to it. And so he wore some of Esau's clothes in order that might convince Isaac even more that he was Esau rather than Jacob. So, did it work? Yes, it did. Was Esau happy about this? No, he was not. And how long were the brothers in feuding formation before they were able to reconcile? Yes. 20 years! 20 years they had this family feud going on before they were able to come back and reconcile. Now, that was Jacob and Esau. Who remembers what else happened with Jacob with the whole wrestling with a guy at night or something thing? Yeah. He wrestled with God, and what happened with that whole deal? What happened after he wrestled with God? Yes. He was renamed Israel. That's right. Israel is the new name that Jacob has. Now, we are going to kind of jump ahead a little bit in this. We're not going to talk too much about the rest of the book of Genesis, but it is important to understand some of the things that happen so we understand some of the promises that God made. So, I want to talk a little bit about Israel, Jacob's sons. Israel had 12 sons, one of whom is kind of famous because he had a really fancy coat. Does anybody know who that would have been? You might even call it an amazing Technicolor dream coat. Joseph, that's right, that's him up there. Joseph and his 11 brothers. Now, Joseph and his 11 brothers were all the children of Jacob, or Israel. And they had their own family feuds. They had their own problems that eventually ended up with the whole family, including all the brothers, including Israel, moving from where they lived all the way over to Egypt because there was a famine, and Joseph, because his brothers had kind of done him rotten, ended up being kind of in charge of what was happening in Egypt. And when they reconciled from their feud, all of their family, what became known as the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel and all their families, ended up moving into Egypt, right? And that's where there was a lot of good food. They were kind of friends with the Egyptians at the time. It was really a great, great pairing. And that lasted for a number of generations. However, it didn't stay that way. You see, when the 12 tribes of Israel moved to Egypt, they really prospered there, even more than the Egyptians did, to the point where the Israelites began to outnumber the Egyptians after a few generations. And that made the Egyptians kind of scared, because they have these people who were part of their kingdom, but not really. And by this time, there had been enough generational drift that people didn't really remember Joseph. They didn't remember Israel. They didn't remember all those people who had kind of done good things for the Egyptians. And it became a point of order where the Egyptian king, known as Pharaoh, ended up enslaving all of the Israelites and making them serve the Egyptian people. It also got to the point where the Israelites still grew in number, and the Pharaoh was going to have the Israelite babies killed, and did have a bunch of Israelite babies killed to try to control their numbers. And that's where we're going to start off with our lesson today, jumping from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. And we're going to be talking about somebody in particular. But before we do, I want to bring us back to our memory verse from last time. Now, this was the promise that God made to Israel. God made to Jacob, right? Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Today, we're going to start to see where that promise of God starts to take root. Because remember, they went to Egypt. Things were good for a while. Then they weren't so good. They were enslaved. They were starting to be killed. This was not a good situation. Enter our person for today, Moses, who becomes the leader of what's called the Exodus. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But before we do, let's watch a video kind of to talk a little bit about who Moses is.
God's story, Moses. So part of God's story is about a guy named Moses, and it begins like this. When Moses was born, God's special family, the Israelites, were living in Egypt as slaves. But there were so many Israelites that Pharaoh, Egypt's ruler, was afraid they might attack him. So he ordered that they work extra hard and made a law that all new baby boys had to be killed. Well, baby Moses' mom didn't want him to die, so she came up with a plan. She put him in a waterproof basket and hid it in the Nile River. Before long, Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, showed up. She found the basket and realized Moses was one of the babies her dad was trying to kill. But instead of hurting Moses, she adopted him. He grew up in the palace like a prince. Now Moses should have felt really special and loved, but he felt bad that his people were slaves while he lived in the palace. So he ran away and tried to help them. Problem is, they didn't want a prince around. Moses didn't feel like he belonged anywhere, so he ran away again. This time, he went to a place called Midian. There, he married a lady named Zipporah and worked for her dad, Jethro. One day, he was taking care of Jethro's sheep when he saw a bush on fire. As Moses looked more closely, the inside of the bush called out, "Moses! Moses!" Kids, would you answer a burning bush that yells your name? Well, Moses did. He said, "Here I am." Then the bush introduced itself. It was God appearing as fire. And God told Moses that he could see how his family was suffering as slaves. Since God loves his family, he wanted to rescue them through Moses. Now you'd think Moses would be excited since he had wanted to help his people, but he wasn't. He didn't think he was special enough to get a job from God. He said, "Why me?" God reminded him, "I'll be with you." He even told Moses exactly what to say to the Egyptians. But Moses didn't think anyone would believe that God had appeared to a regular guy like him, a guy who didn't even belong anywhere. So God gave Moses 3 miracles to prove that God was with him. First, God let Moses turn his staff into a snake and back. Next, Moses put his hand in his cloak. It came out with leprosy. Then he did it again to cure it. Finally, God showed Moses how to turn water into blood. But even after God showed him all this, Moses was still afraid that nobody would listen to him. "I don't talk well," he said. "I stutter and stammer." Then God asked Moses, "Who makes a man able to talk? God is the one who makes us." And he wanted Moses to remember that and trust him. But Moses begged, "Please, send anybody else." Fortunately, God loves us even when we're afraid to trust him and we don't realize how special we are to him. He let Moses bring his brother Aaron along to do the talking. After that, Moses finally realized he belonged in God's family. He didn't have to run away anymore, so he obeyed God and followed him. He took his wife and sons to Egypt to tell the Israelites that God was going to rescue them. The Israelites believed that God was with Moses, and they were so excited to be rescued that they worshiped God right away. And that's the story of Moses. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. God's family lived in Egypt. They were slaves. Pharaoh said baby boys must die. Moses' mom had a plan. Moses was adopted. He ran away. Moses returned to his people. He ran away. God appeared as fire. Moses argued with God. Finally, Moses obeyed. He knew he belonged in God's family. And that's a part of God's story.
All right, so that's the start of Moses' story. We're going to fill in a few more pieces there, but who can kind of fill me in on what we just watched? What happened with Moses? What was his deal? Let's go to the start. How did things start for Moses? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, he was born a slave, because again, all of the Israelites, the people of God, were enslaved in Egypt. So he was born a slave, and there was a law that was passed. What did the law say? Any baby boy Israelite would have to be killed. That is an incredibly brutal law. Why do you think Pharaoh passed that law? Any ideas why he was passing that law? Yeah. He was scared that they would start to outnumber the Egyptians, right? And so he passed this law to try to control their numbers. Now, that, of course, was not good news for the families of all of these babies, right? And so what does Moses' mother decide to do to try to get away from that terrible law impacting their family? Who remembers what they decided to do with Moses? Yeah, Bree. Yeah, she put him in a basket, a waterproof basket, probably made with reeds, and put him in the river, the Nile. Now, can you imagine, for you parents out there, holy cow, right? I can't imagine doing that with my son. That is a huge act of desperate faith, right? That you are going to try to save your child's life by putting him in a river basket and sending him away to who knows what's going to happen. Thankfully, in this situation, that ended up being part of what was going to end up happening to save all of the people of Israel. Because what happened with Moses? Who found the basket? Who remembers who found Moses in the water? Let's go over, Chastity. The princess of Egypt, basically the daughter of the person who had passed that law, didn't really like the law and said, oh my gosh, here's a baby. I can't let this baby die. I'm going to adopt this baby, right? I'm going to bring this child into our family, raise this boy as a prince in the Egyptian family. And so that's what ends up happening with Moses. And so as Moses gets older, he grows up and he knows that he's an Israelite. He knows that all of his family is still enslaved under the king of Egypt. And he finds himself in a place where he wants to try to do something about it, but he doesn't really have the ability to. In fact, there's this situation that ends up happening where he sees an Egyptian guard whipping an Israelite slave, and he straight up murders the guard. Like he attacks him and kills this guy, which means why he has to run away. He flees to Midian to get away from being arrested for murdering a guard. Ends up being this shepherd in the middle of nowhere in Midian. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Wow, that is crazy. That is cool. Yeah, that idea of God showing some of those miracles of the changing of the staff into a snake and back, I mean, that's part of what ends up happening later on in Moses' story. But before we get there, we have this encounter with the burning bush, right? You guys remember this story, or have you heard this story before? Moses is out as a shepherd taking care of the sheep, and he comes across this bush that's on fire without burning up. Now, this is kind of a strange thing. Have you guys ever seen a bush that's on fire but doesn't burn up? I have. You have. Hey, that's awesome. I have not. And in this case, what is the bush? Who is the bush? It's God. It's a manifestation of God. That's right. And God is coming to Moses to tell him that he wants Moses to be the answer to that prayer, that promise that God made last week to Israel, that I will bring you back to the place from which I have called you, that I will save your people out of slavery. Now, is Moses very enthusiastic about this idea? He is not. He is not excited about the idea of being the person to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let the Israelites go, which we can't really blame him for, right? I mean, who here wants that job? Who here wants to go to the king who's in charge of everything, who first wanted to kill you when you were a baby, and then wants to arrest you and throw you in jail for murdering a guard and tell him that he has to let all of his slaves go? I don't want that job. You want that job, Ava? Oh, I am proud of you because, man, I tell you, that is terrifying to me. You guys do too? You guys are awesome. Fantastic. I hope that you're able to answer that call someday. But, man, I tell you, it is a terrifying thing to speak truth to power. And it's complicated for Moses in that, as we kind of saw a little bit in the video, he was not a good speaker. He stuttered a lot. He didn't do well in front of people, right? Has anybody ever felt that way, where you really get nervous about talking in front of people and you don't want to do that very often? Maybe in school or in a class where you have to talk in front of the class. Who here gets nervous by that? Yeah? Some of you do? That was me too, absolutely. And so I can understand Moses not wanting to do that. In fact, he even says to God, this is impossible, I can't do it, send someone else. Just send someone else. And God says, I will give you the tools that you need in order to do what I have called you to do. In fact, bring your brother Aaron. He's a good speaker. I will give you the words. You can have him help you. You'll get this done. Don't worry. I'll be with you. And this gets to a point that I really want to hammer home. that often when we think of the people that God uses to do incredible things, we think of people who are just absolutely amazing people who are, kind of top tier, above the average kind of people. That's not the kind of person that God usually uses, right? There's a phrase that says, God does not call the qualified, but God qualifies the called. And what that means is that God doesn't go out and pick the most important and the strongest and the smartest people. God picks the ordinary people, the people who really might be missing a few things, and God gives them what they need in order to do these important works. And Moses, who becomes like the most important prophet ever, is one of those people who was not super impressive, and yet God used him to do absolutely amazing things. So, to go ahead in the story, because I want to make sure I get through the story before we have to go on. Moses does what God says, goes to Egypt, goes to the Pharaoh and says, you got to let my people go. You got to let the Israelites go. What do you think Pharaoh says? No. Of course he says no. I'm not going to let you do that. I'm not going to let you take my entire workforce and leave. And so what ends up happening is that God sends a number of, or 10 of what we call plagues. These kind of bad things that happen to Egypt to try to get Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And the final plague that after all of these plagues, Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do it. Nope, 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 nope. The very last one was something where the Bible says that the angel of death goes over all the houses in all of Israel, or all of Egypt, and takes the life of the firstborn son from all the houses, except from the houses of those who had done this thing called the Passover, and putting like the lamb's blood on the door where they lived, which was the Israelites, right? He goes over the house of the Israelites are spared, but the Egyptians lose their firstborn son, including Pharaoh. And it's after that 10th plague that Pharaoh finally says, okay, just get out of here. I don't want you around here anymore. Now, he doesn't totally give up, but I'm not going to give that too much. At that point, basically the Israelites get up, they leave, they take whatever they have on them, and they head back out to the promised land. And that's the Exodus. That's where we get the word Exodus, which is the name of the second book of the Bible. Anybody know what Exodus means? It doesn't mean second, but that's a really good guess. Middle? No. It means exit. They exit Egypt. They leave Egypt. And so the Exodus is the act of taking a leave, right? Leaving and going back to the promised land from which they came. Okay, so before we jump into a couple other last minute things, our memory verse today is from Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 10, where it talks about Moses. It says, never since I should say this straight up, never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So this is saying again that Moses is like the most important prophet in all of Israelite culture, in all of Israelite history. And he's someone who didn't want the job, who didn't find himself qualified for the job, but for whom God gave the gifts in order to accomplish the goal. All right, so our first vocab word tonight is the one we just started talking about, Exodus. What's it mean? Exit. Yes, it means exit. And in this context, when we talk about Exodus with a capital E, the proper noun, that Exodus is God leading the Israelites out of slavery. Okay? So any random Exodus, you could say, I'm exodusing from the building right now, but that would be Exodus with a small e. Exodus with a big E is God leading the Israelites out of slavery. All right, and a plague. We talked a little bit about this, the 10 plagues that God sent on Egypt. Yes? Something bad, yeah, a great affliction, something bad. Often this is talking like about a disease, right? Have you guys ever heard of like the Black Plague before? It's this really bad disease that struck basically the entire world, like about 700 to 500 years ago, over that period of time. And there was basically no place in the old world that was ever untouched by the bubonic plague. And so this idea of a plague is something that affects everybody, and it is absolutely decimating to those who experience it. Polio? Yeah, you could absolutely call polio a plague, for sure. So Passover, I mentioned this a little bit. Does anybody remember what Passover is or was? And I'll talk a little more about this. Let's see, who has not talked yet? Yeah, Evan. One more time, a little bit louder. Yeah, the final plague, and considered kind of the one that kind of made Pharaoh let everybody go. Now, this is something too that I want to touch on as well, is that the Passover is also a feast that Jewish people celebrate up until today. In fact, the supper where Jesus celebrated Holy Communion for the first time was a Passover meal. Every year, from the days of Moses until now, the Jewish people celebrate once a year that event of the Passover, when they eat unleavened bread, when they celebrate together and they remember the promise that God made to save them out of Egypt. And when we consider that here in our context, Passover is that final plague when the first child of the Egyptians died, but the Israelites were saved. So that's kind of a part of the story of Moses. And I'm trying to get through a lot of this stuff because tonight's the only night we really have time to cover Moses. And man, there's so much more that happens in the book of Exodus. But I kind of want to just give you a snapshot of this really important event. The Exodus is one of those events that happened in Jewish history that everything else is surrounded, right? It is so important that to this day, it remains one of the most important events in the entire culture. And so when we read these stories, we remember that in these times, even people who didn't have like the best abilities to do anything were able to be so influential that even now, so many people talk about Moses and name people after Moses because of what God was able to do through him. So, let's ask the question, Martin Luther's question. What does this mean? What do we take away from the story? What do we learn from the story? What do we think God wants us to understand about the Exodus? Chastity. How God is always with you and will always be able to help you. Yeah, that no matter what we go through, God is going to be with us. And so even when the Israelites ended up in slavery, it took a while, but God remembered that promise that God had made and sent a rescuer to free them from slavery. What else? What else might we take away from this story? I saw some more hands back there. Was it the same thing? Yeah? Anything else? Something that I really like about this story and that I really get a lot of meaning from myself is kind of what I've been getting at this whole night, right? That Moses was not like the most perfect person in the entire world. Frankly, he was a murderer, right? He had killed somebody, and he wasn't really good at what he was doing. He wasn't someone who had natural gifts for public speaking. He wasn't someone who had a natural charisma around him. And yet, God was able to use him to do things that were so important and so pivotal for so many people. That to me is inspiring because I know that I'm not perfect either, and I don't have a lot of those gifts either. And yet God can still use me and use any one of you to do incredible things that mean the world to people. And so when we read this story, I hope that we can remember no matter who we are, no matter how we might think we might not have skills to do things, God can make use of us to do absolutely incredible things. Okay, so now when we go into our small groups, you're going to have some more time to delve a little more deeply into the details of the story of Moses and the Exodus. Everybody, get out of here.